We're frogging and bogging as we close out September with M Network's next batch of games. Following Mattel's initial and successful debut of the VCS in July, the company published its next set of titles under the M Network label in September. And happily, just as with the last group, every one of these carts is a top-notch conversion from the Intellivision, and in one case, from the arcade. Leading the action tonight is the VCS version of one of Intellivision's launch titles. 1979's Armor Battle was designed in some ways to be an answer to Atari's successful coin-op title Tank, which had its own VCS conversion, Combat, packed in with the console. There, each player takes an armada of 50 tanks into battle, with each side controlling 2 at a time in a map chosen randomly from 240 possible options. Whichever side ran out of tanks first lost the game. Each map had different terrain and objects to navigate through, each environment affecting how you moved and where. Unlike the arcade game, each tank in Armor Battle could take 3 shots or 1 invisible landmine before being destroyed, giving them some durability that nicely complemented the tricky landscapes you're fighting in. Finally, you have to contend with a recoil after each shot, requiring you to reposition your tank's firing angle and giving your opponent a little bit of time to fight back or move. Armor Battle exemplified Mattel's focus on truly console experiences with the Intellivision instead of faster arcade action, something the hardware was well suited to. The VCS is a bit of an awkward fit for these things, and yet Armor Ambush is an absolutely brilliant rendition that carries forward the bulk of Armor Battle's game design and swaps out the mechanics that had to be cut for some new ones. First, the losses. The invisible mine has been removed, likely due to a lack of inputs on the controller. The game also loses the ability to set its speed, and the number of maps appears to have been cut down, though I found no specifics on by how much. Sources typically say they are randomly generated instead. Finally, the number of tanks on each side has been slashed in half to 25. To make up for these changes, flipping the left difficulty switch to A revives the tank pong mechanic from Combat, and allows your shells to go bouncing around the playfield. These can allow you to hit your opponent without risking getting in their direct line of sight, but your shell can also bounce right back and hit you, too. Armor Battle was written by Chris Kingsley, but Armor Ambush was developed by Hal Finney, who unfortunately did not have much to say on the game in his interviews before he passed away in 2013. Nevertheless, we do know Mattel actively worked with programmers to identify popular Intellivision games that would translate well to the VCS, and Armor Ambush certainly fits the bill. The graphics took an understandable hit in fidelity, but the roads, plains, forests, waterways, and buildings are all here and easily identifiable. The controls are similar to those in Combat, making it easy to pick up and play if you've ever tried Atari's own pack-in title, which is a pretty fair assumption when every console not sold by Sears included the cart. The button fires your cannon, left and right rotate your tank, pushing up makes you drive forward, and pulling down will flip your control to your other tank, assuming it hasn't been blown up yet. It's intuitive and would make sense to someone trying it for the first time in 1982. If Armor Ambush has any weakness, it's that it requires a second player to actually be playable. For 1982, this was unusual, and is likely a factor that seemed to have doomed the completed but unreleased conversion of Sea Battle in the original game Sword Fight from reaching market. But if you had another person to play it with, Armor Ambush was great fun, and this is still the case today. This is genuinely one of the finest 2-player games on the hardware by my reckoning, and cutting the number of tanks on each side from the Intellivision original helps speed up the pace of matches to a more manageable flow. The randomized maps and starting locations require you to really think on your feet and protect whichever tank may be the most damaged or is currently going uncontrolled. That said, if you find yourself on a losing streak, the tank deficit can be difficult to overcome unless you've got ricocheting shots on to better protect yourself in combat, but thoughtful play makes each match a joy. That said, of all 3 games on today's lineup, Armor Ambush was recorded as selling the fewest copies. An internal Mattel memo tracking cartridge sales through June 1983 marked it down as moving 119,200 copies in 1982, with another 8,700 through the first half of 1983, which in turn followed the 1,500 returns. It isn't the lowest selling of the company's 1982 VCS titles, an outcome that is bestowed on international soccer, but it had to have been something of a disappointment compared to how well the other titles went. I have to imagine the game requiring 2 players hurt it at retail even in ways Mattel's sports games didn't necessarily have working against it. These sales figures may also serve as evidence for why Atari shelved Combat 2, a sequel to its original game advertised in 1982 before being cancelled. A late beta of the game was released in cartridge form during the 2001 Classic Gaming Expo, and it clearly is pulling from Armor Battle in several ways, including terrain features, armor layers that require multiple shots to get through, and a finite number of tanks for each side. This beta also features a cruise missile weapon that can be launched from a base to target your foe, and a level editor. It's an interesting package, but like Armor Ambush, requires 2 players. A market for video games that couldn't be played solo certainly still existed by 1982, but had shrunk considerably. It's a fair guess that Atari canceled the game for that reason, and given Armor Ambush's sales, it was probably the right call. But, in 2026, free from market pressures, Armor Ambush is a very good time. Recruit some friends and get a few rounds going. My partners for this footage had never tried this game before, and thoroughly enjoyed it. The next 2 VCS releases from Mattel were actually following hot on the heels of their Intellivision counterparts. In fact, this title, Lock and Chase, debuted in September on both platforms. In both cases, we're looking at an excellent conversion of Data East's arcade original of the same name. Mattel was fairly late to the party in terms of snapping up home licenses from coin-op developers. Atari, Coleco, and Parker Brothers had grabbed major games from companies like Williams, Exidy, Universal, Sega, Gottlieb, and Nintendo. Mattel was stuck licensing out games from Konami and Data East, neither of which had a great deal of distribution in North America in the early 80s. Mattel was meticulous about its market research, and despite these minor licenses, the company had sent its staff to arcades to determine what players were interested in. Their findings that teen boys preferred fast-paced, more aggressive games more often than girls did, and that it was more common for teen girls to find playing in public uncomfortable. This shaped both its original game offerings and its home conversions of arcade games, which were focused heavily on fidelity to the source material where possible. The first game out from this initiative was Lock and Chase. This was a maze game in the vein of Pac-Man that had debuted in American arcades around August 1981, but never made major waves here. The game puts you in the hat of Master Thief Lupin, not to be confused with Lupin III, which was clearly what Data East was referencing without a license. Your goal is to go through the maze of a bank vault to steal all the gold bars and escape while being chased by police. There are doors that periodically open and close, and you can manually shut a few doors at a given time to delay or block your pursuers. You also occasionally have bonus valuables that pop up in the middle of the screen. Originally produced for Data East's Deco cassette system, where games were sold separate from the board on microcassette tapes in a sort of proto-Neo Geo arrangement, Lock and Chase was also licensed out to Taito for release in the Americas. It's not quite Pac-Man, but in a time when Atari had that license locked down, Mattel took a gamble on a similar game. The Intellivision version was given to Mike Winans, who would later be poached by Atari and tasked with the Intellivision version of Pac-Man on the strength of this conversion. The initial 6KB release reportedly suffered from control issues, as Lupin would stop in his tracks if you failed to make a turn precisely. Julie Hoshizaki was asked to make a fix for the second print run that essentially prevents Lupin from stopping dead on a missed input. It also included some additional animation for Lupin when he's caught, making that the most obvious way to tell them apart. That said, collectors have never really turned up a cartridge copy of this expanded 8KB version to my knowledge, though the ROM is certainly floating around online nowadays. It's a very solid rendition that I'll speak to further in its own video, successfully carrying over all of the coin-ops mechanics and making great use of the Intellivision's graphical capabilities to reproduce it visually. For the VCS, APH's Bruce Pedersen was assigned to bring the arcade game to a platform famously considered ill-suited to a Pac-Man-style title. Pedersen, to my knowledge, has never given an interview about his work on the VCS, but he is credited for co-writing Space Attack with Hal Finney and the unreleased Sea Battle conversion alongside Larry Zwick, which was known as High Seas internally, as per the company's policy of renaming titles for the VCS. After that trio of Mattel projects, he appears to have jumped ship to Imagic, impressing them with his ability to build an in-circuit emulator for the VCS and reverse engineer the video signal in 2 days. He went on to do conversions of their titles to computer platforms, such as Demon Attack and Dragonfire to the VIC-20. Lock and Chase for the VCS is not going to win any awards for visual design. Lupin is rendered pretty well, but the police officers are essentially large blue stick figures, and the bonus items are indistinct blocks. But it does play fairly similar to how Lock and Chase is supposed to. The maze layout is largely the same, the bonus treasures pop up for similarly short intervals, and you still have to escape out the door to finish a stage. The big changes are with the doors. For one, only horizontal doors exist in this version, likely due to how the hardware manages the screen per scan line. And furthermore, only Lupin can close doors. You never have to contend with random door closures. You'd think this gives the player an advantage compared to the other versions, but the lack of vertical doors really does make it easy to get put into a bad spot where you can't escape the cops chasing you. The options also make for a good comparison point to Atari's Pac-Man, released earlier in 1982. The difficulty switches adjust the starting game speed. On difficulty B, everything is set to slow and speeds up as the game goes on, while A starts everything at a fast speed. But more relevant is that Lock and Chase includes a two-player mode. In making Pac-Man, Todd Fry used much of the VCS's memory to retain the state of the playfield between each player's turn. In hindsight, this caused a lot of the game's other perceived problems, but he felt it important to ensure that it had a fully featured mode for two people. Here, Pedersen does not do that, and so every time a player is caught in a two-player game, their playfield is reset to being uncleared. It does make it more obvious why Fry made the decision he did, but it also suggests that maybe this game didn't need to include a two-player mode on the hardware. That aside, Lock and Chase is probably the best maze chase game available on the VCS by this point. Compared to the flawed Pac-Man and the fussy navigation of Apollo's Shark Attack, Mattel's cart is a real step up. Lupin, who goes unnamed in the game's materials for copyright reasons, is pretty responsive, and the changes to how the doors operate balances out reasonably well with how the police move and chase after you. It's not quite the arcade game in terms of pacing or action, but like a lot of other solid VCS conversions, it carries forward the spirit and important aspects of its source material, even if it fails to be fully accurate. Even though Lock and Chase is hardly a top-tier license, Mattel ran with it. A 1982 commercial showcased the company's arcade action games, notably Lock and Chase, Tron Deadly Discs, and Night Stalker. In addition to the Intellivision and VCS, it also received a solid port to the Apple II done by an outsourced developer in Taiwan, which features detailed, fully animated, and very goofy sprites, the full maze, and all the doors you'd want from the arcade. An IBM PC port was completed by programmer Gene Smith but never went to manufacturing, and has not turned up since. Nevertheless, the home console versions appeared to do moderately well for Mattel. In 1982, the Intellivision version moved 415,700 units, and the VCS 415,300 units. The Intellivision version maintained a positive flow through June 1983, ending its recording period with a total of 539,000 units sold. Meanwhile, the VCS ended at 445,100 copies sold, after a little under than 2,000 were returned. After Mattel Electronics closed its doors and sold its video game business to INTV, the new entity continued to make it available alongside the rest of the M-Network VCS offerings, but so did Telegames USA, the rare M-Network title the outfit licensed that it actively sold in the United States and not simply just in PAL territories. Despite never being a major hit, Data East and its successors did make Lock and Chase available beyond the 80s. A remake was one of the early and well-regarded Game Boy releases, and it made an appearance on the Wii Data East collection, albeit with funky audio bugs. Most recently, it turned up on an Evercade Data East arcade cartridge. It remains to be seen if Atari will make an arrangement with the relevant owners of Data East's catalog to bring the home versions back out, but either way, this is a pretty good one to check out, even if some of the later maze games on the VCS are a bit more impressive. Our final game this video is a personal favorite, and to me a deeply underrated two-player experience that shines with the right game options. I'm speaking to the VCS conversion of Mattel's Intellivision title Frogbog, known as Frogs and Flies. Frogbog, reportedly released in limited quantities around June with availability picking up come September and October, puts players in the fins of a frog in a swamp. Your goal is to jump between a pair of lily pads, trying to eat as many bugs as possible and earn more points than the other frog before the time period of the game concludes. There have been comparisons made online between Frogbog and the 1978 Gremlin arcade game Frogs, which has a very similar concept of a player-controlled frog moving left and right and jumping up to grab bugs. According to designer Lane Hauck in an interview with historian Ethan Johnson, Frogs was designed to be more appealing to women, who to that point had not engaged with coin-op games to the same extent men had. Hauck had made the assumption that they weren't as interested in violent themes. Bill Blewett put together the overlaid artwork depicting a swamp, while Lonnie Pogue drew that theming out further to the whole cabinet. Rounding out the team was Ago Kiss, who helped Hauck with programming. Frogbog seems to really only superficially compare to Frogs, with very different movement and the addition of a second player, which makes it much more of a competitive experience. Nevertheless, that core conceit of trying to reach different audiences than the norm connects both titles, as does the frog eat bug theming. In Frogbog, each kind of bug has different movement patterns and are worth differing amounts of points based on their species. While the game defaults to 2 players, if a second player doesn't make any inputs, after a few seconds the computer will take control and make for a rudimentary challenge. To provide some variety for players, you can opt for one of 3 different control settings, changeable mid-game and adjustable for each player. The easiest will automatically stick the frog's tongue out when a bug is nearby and limit your mobility to a set jump arc between the lily pads. The medium difficulty still handles the tongue, but now requires you to directly control your frog's movement, and the hardest difficulty gives you the same moves, but now you also have to control your tongue with the side buttons. Finally, you get to choose the time of your frog duel between day or night. Daylight makes everything fairly easy to see, while nighttime action automatically starts each player at difficulty 2 and makes all the bugs light up like fireflies. Targeted towards children, Frogbog was not one of the hottest titles Mattel had on the market, with 331,200 copies sold by mid-1983. But these weren't terrible numbers either, and the concept evidently seemed doable on the VCS, as Frogs and Flies, as it was renamed, followed Frogbog to stores not long after. For this conversion, APH's David Rolfe took the job, explaining in a 2004 interview that he took on the assignment following Super Challenge Baseball because he could and because it would be a lot simpler to port. He did leave some personal instructions for the game when submitting it, slagging on the VCS and the families who chose it, and Frogs and Flies, over the Intellivision. Rolfe indicated in his interview that this was one of the ways engineers amused themselves, by being weird behind the scenes, while ensuring the final product flew on the straight and narrow once in the spotlight. In my own correspondence, he indicated that while he did the gameplay, he was not responsible for Frogs and Flies graphics. He didn't remember who did them, but believed it was someone at APH given the speculative nature of the project, which I delved into further in episode 77 of this series. Frogbog is a highlight of the Intellivision's 2-player library, and the same is true for Frogs and Flies. This one is streamlined a fair bit. All flies are worth the same 2-point value, there's no nighttime mode, and your only difficulty options, controlled with the difficulty switches, are the default easiest with defined jump arcs, and automatic tonguing or full manual control. Like Frogbog, you can also go up against the computer by leaving the other frog long enough, which will always default to the easy movement. And once again, after a few minutes of play, the sun will go down and the game will end. So why is such a simple game one that I consistently go to bat for? And it comes down to movement. For small children, difficulty B's easy jumps make for a good enough time, and it's fine enough for getting your feet wet when you're older too. But Frogs and Flies absolutely shines brighter than the fireflies that come out at night when you flip those switches to A. Your frogs are incredibly responsive. The direction you push on the stick and how long you press affects your angle and distance, and once you get a feel for this, you can consistently avoid jumping into the water and wasting time. Frogs and Flies is a game of skill and positioning, and compared to Frogbog, the VCS controller's responsiveness will just feel better next to the Intellivision's disc and input polling rate. You don't have all of the nice additional wrinkles from its cousin, and that can make it harder to make a comeback if you're well behind at points. But I'm not sure Frogs and Flies is necessarily worse despite this. Frogbog and Frogs and Flies do seem to have a correlation, if not causation, to the cancellation of a similar title from Atari called Frog Pond. Announced for release around November 1982 before very quietly just never shipping. This is practically the same concept where players control frogs trying to eat flies. According to AtariProtos.com, Nick Turner, the game's developer, wanted to expand it to 8K with additional game options, but management declined. Atari Protos notes it received a Sears number as well, making this likely the would-be final Sears label VCS game. Despite advertising the game and even seemingly shipping preview copies to reviewers, with coverage routinely indicating it was available well into 1983, Frog Pond just never materialized. Did Frog Bog cause its cancellation, or was it poor market testing, or something else entirely? The mystery remains. Frogs and Flies' mediocre sales figures may show some insight, though. According to Mattel's records, through June 1983, only 141,000 units had been sold, 127,000 of which had gone out in 1982. None of the M-Network titles cracked 500,000 units by the end of the tracking period, but this was not a fast mover. Frogs and Flies thankfully persists, and even inspired Frog Feast, a homebrew game developed by Rastersoft around 2005 and released on a whole slew of 90s-era game systems in the ensuing years. I don't know that I'd call this better than its inspirations, but it has a following even now, and having this kind of game available on a broad swath of platforms is certainly appealing. Regardless of your age or skill level, Frogs and Flies is an all-time great for the platform and extremely playable today. My recording pals for this video had no experience with it or Frog Bog before our session, and both came away with nothing but praise for the VCS version in particular. It's a pretty game, but also one that shows you don't need flashy visuals and sci-fi settings to make a good game. You can get by with a swamp and some amphibians just fine. And as of today, Frogs and Flies and Armor Ambush are both available in multiple formats, from older Atari Flashback dedicated consoles to the Atari 50 collection, and a compilation cartridge for the 2600 Plus. Lock and Chase is less accessible, but all three are worth your time, especially if you have another player. Coverage of all three of these games was generally positive, albeit with some caveats. Starting with Armor Ambush, the video game update gave this one 2.5 stars for graphics and play, writing that it was slow-paced and not visually exciting, but looked better than combat and appealing to those who liked war games. Electronic Games called it an excellent head-to-head game on the system with a lot of excitement, commenting further in an article about war games from July 1983 that Armor Battle and its scaled-down equivalent were the best tank games available. An article in Video and Computer Gaming Illustrated noted Armor Ambush was the only military game on the VCS that could be considered strategic in how it's played, owing to its varying terrain and dual tank setup. Years later, Retro Gamer called it one of Mattel's defining games on the VCS. Lock and Chase also received a warm reception. TV Gamer wrote about it being a strong variation on Pac-Man's themes with reasonable graphics, sound, and general accuracy to the arcade. Electronic Games called it streamlined compared to the Intellivision version, but still one of the best maze chase games available on the VCS, a description echoed in its Arcade Express review. In Logical Gamer, Alan Bechtold referred to it as simpler in both graphics and variables to contend with, but still quite responsive. Mike Wilson, on the other hand, was not impressed, writing that it was repetitive and too simplistic compared to other maze games on the console, such as Shark Attack. And the video game update dubbed it as one of the best maze games available on the VCS, but with simple and clean graphics and responsive controls. In the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Lou Hudson went further, calling it and its Intellivision cousin the best maze chase games available, followed closely by Ladybug on the ColecoVision. Frogs and Flies has had a bit more of a mixed reception between people who seemed to get it and those who didn't. Video Game Update called it a great translation of the excellent Frog Bog and noted, accurately I might add, that older kids would enjoy plopping the frogs into the water for the splash and sound effect. Electronic Games indicated it was a solid entry-level game for young kids, but with enough appeal for older players too. TV Gamer called Frogs and Flies a good game for, yet again, young kids, but maybe too easy for older ones. On the flip side, Logical Gamer's reviewers both bounced off of Frogs and Flies and its counterpart Frog Bog, considering them too simplistic to hold anyone's attention but the youngest children. And its reputation remained mixed in the aftermarket. In the 1998 zine Orphaned Computer Game Systems, Chris Federico dubbed it one of the 10 worst games on the VCS. While in a 1994 issue of Digital Press, Joe Santulli wrote about how addictive it and Frog Bog were to play. And having reached the end of September 1982, we have another installment of our Crash Watch segment. There is not a huge amount to report this go-round, even though retailers were gearing up for the holiday season. The first signs of the downturning market started showing up in industry coverage last month, but further evidence was reported on in Retail Trade magazine Merchandising, which found department stores were seeing a measurable decrease in game sales, but discounters and catalog retailers doing well. On that note, holiday catalogs started going out in September with discounts on the VCS and in television systems. And that said, companies were beginning to report their second quarter results as well, with Mattel indicating it had brought in net sales of $125 million, up more than $69 million from the same period in 1981. Also of note, third-party companies had started jumping onto the hardware game with new accessories for existing game systems, particularly the VCS. These ranged from new controllers to console storage. And finally, on September 25th, ABC debuted a cartoon version of Pac-Man, bringing video games to television animation for the first time. In the computer space, the price war continues with the VIC-20 and TI-99 4A, each available for under $200 thanks to price drops and rebates. Tangentially related, Mattel also formally gave up the Ghost on its keyboard component this month, indicating that it simply could not make the economics for it work in its test markets. This is likely especially true given the expectation that it would retail for $700 compared to the price-reduced machines available in 1982. In arcades, Atari shuffled some of its coin-op staff out of that department, while monitor manufacturer Wells Gardner reported that its quarterly sales were down due to orders being postponed, another indication that the coin-op golden age was winding down. Historian Keith Smith noted in his unpublished All in Color for a Quarter manuscript that industry newspapers, magazines, and studies found the coin-op market was oversaturated and that players were moving on from new games quicker than ever by this summer. By this point, no game would sell in excess of 50,000 units until the 1990s, leaving fewer hits for console makers to license and bring home to sell their systems. Trades and analysts each offered different explanations, and likely the truth stemmed from all of them to some extent. Too many operators, too many games, in both raw numbers, on location, and in terms of new ones coming out, the economics no longer working to turn a profit, and a general economic downturn. I don't want to belabor the coin-op industry's struggles at this point, as it will continue to slide into 1984 before recovering in the mid-80s. But this separate, distinct crash did impact the console market in its own way. There are still a number of notable coin-op conversions to come for the VCS and its competitors, but that pipeline is starting to run dry, leaving companies to pull from B and C listers and increasingly, the computer realm. Next time, things are getting real.